Welcome back to Varnadore Films. My name is Seth Varnadore. I'm a former high school and college football coach who now talks about college football here on YouTube. SEC Media Days just concluded within the past week or so. And with that, you get the media's picks for the conference winner and the division winners. It's hard to see here in the SEC East. You've got Georgia as a presumptive favorite. Kentucky comes in second, surprisingly. Tennessee third, Florida fourth, South Carolina fifth, Missouri third, and Vanderbilt seventh, with one first place vote. So, they got a shot at being the best football program in the country there, according to one media member. But the big surprise, I think, was kind of the order behind Georgia. Everyone's talking about Georgia's obviously number one. Who's second in the East? Who's third in the SEC overall? It certainly appears that the media thinks it's either Kentucky or Tennessee. You see in votes, Kentucky's or in points, they're 932 points. Tennessee 929. So close second. Florida kind of a distant fourth there. So just going off this, I want to take a look back at the SEC East and just kind of preview the season, looking at some numbers from last year, what people are returning, and see how Florida stacks up in that context of kind of looking at the wider SEC East here. So we're going to go back, look at some stats from 2021 that I like to look at when I'm checking out teams, and then see what people are returning talent-wise, production-wise, and then just kind of talk about where teams stand in terms of like Vegas odds and things like that. So we'll start with some stats that I kind of enjoy looking at. Just looking back at 2021 for these various teams. So let's go full screen here so we see it. So looking at the 2021 stats, yards per play is a metric that got really popular, and it's kind of waning in popularity a little bit, but it does give you some context to kind of what your offense or defense is able to prove on kind of a consistent basis. So Georgia, looking back at last year, obviously had an unbelievable season on both sides of the ball. They were pretty good in yards per play on offense. You kind of think of their offense as being their weakness, but they were third in the country in yards per play last year. Yards per play numbers I got from BCF Toys. Really good advanced stats site run by Mr. Framo, I believe his name is. Check them out if you want kind of these advanced drive numbers. So yards per play, you see Georgia number one in the East last year on offense and defense, number one in the country on defense, number one in net yards per play. So just subtracting what do you gain on offense, what do you lose, or what do you give up on defense, right? 3.3 net yards per play, number one in the country. Kentucky was surprised. I was a little surprised looking at how good Kentucky's advanced numbers are. They were ninth in the country in yards per play on offense, which kind of surprised me a little bit. And then they were probably a little worse than I thought on defense, but their defense is still pretty good at 46 there. Tennessee, obviously, great on offense. They'd be next at 6.63 yards per play, which was good for 11th in the country. But their defense was their deficiency last year. They were 58th in the country in terms of yards per play. That led them to be 20th in net yards per play. Kentucky was 15th. Florida's next in the East at 38th in net yards per play, 36th on offense, 51st on defense. South Carolina, who's kind of been a little bit of a media darling, was really bad on offense last year, and they're going to be kind of riding the wave of those transfers is really what it looks like in the term of a lot of media members' minds, because they were awful on offense last year. You look at every metric, they were terrible. 103rd in the country in yards per play on offense, 83rd in yards per play on defense, 97th in overall net yards per play. Then Missouri and Vanderbilt kind of round out the bottom there. Missouri's just slightly worse than South Carolina in net yards per play last season because their defense was awful, giving up 6.5 yards per play. Vanderbilt's was slightly worse, giving up 6.88 yards per play. So every time somebody ran a play against Vanderbilt, they almost gained 7 yards. So obviously not really conducive to winning a lot of games. On the bottom here, you see Louisiana. I just want to make a note for Florida, kind of where Billy Napier is coming from. They were 15th in the country in net yards per play margin, 16th on defense, 30th on offense. So his teams do pretty good in these advanced numbers. So that's kind of interesting to see and compare them to Florida. Obviously, the schedules are totally different, just to kind of compare where they stand. Then the next measure I like to look at here is EPA, or expected points added, I believe it is, from Parker Fleming at cfb-graphs.com. That's a great resource if you're looking for the kind of those advanced numbers and just kind of a little bit of a different look at it, right? Expected points added, what is it? It's kind of like yards per play, but with a little bit more context. So it puts into context how good was the gain in terms of adding points to your drive or adding points to the game for you. So let's say you get 3 yards on 3rd and 2. Well, that gives you a first down. So that's obviously worth more than a 3-yard rush on 1st and 10, which a 3-yard rush on 1st and 10 will not be considered a successful play by kind of the success number metric. So EPA is kind of an all-encompassing thing. It's a little bit like success rate, a little bit of yards per play, but just basically every time you run a play, are you adding points to yourself? Are you gaining value, or are you losing value? So offensively, you want to be gaining value, right? On EPA per play on offense, Georgia was 16th in the country. Vanderbilt, I think, is 114th here. Let's fix that before we get too excited. Georgia 16th, Kentucky 20th, Tennessee 30th. Florida ended up 70th, but they were in the top 10 for a lot of the year and just tailed off at the end. Their last 4 or 5 games were awful. All the EPA numbers are through the regular season, so they don't count bowl games or playoffs or championship games. Just kind of a 12-game look at what you were last year, just if you're making a note. Florida's EPA defense was not bad. You see Georgia was number 1 in the country. They were taking value away from opposing offenses regularly. South Carolina, interesting note, South Carolina's defense in this metric, EPA defense, was pretty good, 21st in the country, but you see their offense was terrible. But it's kind of a similar – and then the other outlier here is kind of look at Tennessee's defense in this metric. 30th on offense, on defense, 94th. So not great for the Volunteers on defense last year. And when you look at the margin, so EPA margin, Georgia was number 1 in the country. Kentucky was 2nd in the SEC East at 22nd in the country. Who else was 22nd in the country? Louisiana in this metric was 22nd in the country. Florida was 49th, just ahead of Tennessee at 51st. So, and then you kind of get the rest of them. South Carolina 97th, Missouri 110th, and Vanderbilt 119th. The fact that Florida lost to 2 of those teams last year is really kind of shocking going back and looking at the numbers. So those are both interesting. And then available yards is another one from BCF Toys. It's a great metric. Basically, what percentage of available yards to you are you picking up? So if you got a touchdown every time, that means you'd be picking up 100% of the available yards. If you got the ball and went 3 and out, didn't gain a yard every time, it'd be 0%, right? So obviously closer to 100% is what you're aiming for here. Available yards, Georgia, again, top of the division, over 60% of available yards. Kentucky, again, 2nd with 56.9 here. Tennessee would be 3rd on offense, 55.3, Florida 49, and then kind of the rest of the crew. Missouri South Carolina, Vanderbilt. Defensively, Georgia again number 1, but Florida is actually 35th. Kentucky was 29th. Tennessee 82nd in this metric. 82nd in available yards. Then net available yards, Georgia is number 1. Florida 43rd. Kentucky 12th. So Kentucky had really good metrics. Tennessee 45th. So, based on the metrics and really the record, Florida and Tennessee were pretty similar in a lot of these spaces last year, but Tennessee's predicted to take a huge jump forward, and Florida's kind of predicted to take a step back. Kentucky is, we saw, picked second, but what do they have returning? What's their talent level? So let's look at recruiting and talent for the kind of recent recruiting and talent here. So these 2022 team talent composite numbers are based on the average player rating from 24/7, the 24/7 composite. You can find these compiled in a few different places, but I found some at CFB Winning Edge. You can find them on Twitter, and they have a Patreon as well with just treasure troves of information. So if you're like a gambler or you just want more in-depth information, CFB Winning Edge is a really, really good spot to find it. So the team talent composite here, the outline in the teams that are highlighted in blue are blue chip ratio teams. Florida and Georgia are both blue chip ratio teams this season. Looking at the 22 team talent composite, again, based on average player rating, this will not, I don't think this will match perfectly what 24/7 comes out with later when they put it out officially. I think they do some different stuff with it, but this is kind of just based on the average player rating right now. Georgia 3rd, Florida is 9th, so second in talent in the division. Then Tennessee and South Carolina are right there. South Carolina 20th in the country, Tennessee 21st, Kentucky 25th, Missouri 33rd, and Vanderbilt 54th based on this. You look at the composite recruiting overall, and this includes transfers and high school players signed. Vanderbilt signed a really good high school class, but I don't think they brought in a ton of the transfer portal, so they're the bottom, but 47th in the country. Georgia was 3rd, Florida 17th, Kentucky 20, Missouri 18, South Carolina 23, Tennessee 29. And then we kind of look at, all right, well, what's kind of the recent, let's see what's your roster makeup in terms of the recruiting rankings. So here are the recruiting rankings since 2017, or I'm sorry, this is the team talent composite since 2017. So you see Florida's trend was trending upward and getting better, but a little bit of a drop back this year with some of the recruiting efforts of the previous staff. Georgia's somewhat settled. They were number 1 in 2020, second last year, 3rd, but they're in that upper echelon of teams. Kentucky, similar. They're settling, but they kind of took a jump up this year. Missouri, getting better. A lot of these teams you see are really improving as recruiting is because Missouri just signed their best class ever, I think. So you see they make a big jump. They hit the transfer portal as well. South Carolina was recruiting well. They just weren't winning games a lot under Will Muschamp. Tennessee, similar, always recruited pretty well, just couldn't win the games. But you see they're still kind of in the top 25 of talent in terms of talent in the country. Vanderbilt lagging behind, but still pretty good compared to the rest of the country. You kind of see the 5-year net change. Florida's gained a little bit from 2018 till now 3. Georgia's kind of stagnant. Missouri's actually gained the most, and then you see Tennessee and Vanderbilt have actually lost kind of compared to where they were. And then you look at recruiting class ranking, and these are all 24/7 composite class rankings. Georgia has a 6-year average of the 2.33. So I included 6 years because there's that COVID year for some guys. So there may be a few guys included in those classes. So their 6-year average is the 2.33. So they're signed, obviously, a couple number 1 classes. They're averaging, better than a top 3 class the last 6 years. Florida is next at 12th. Obviously, there's a big chasm there between Georgia and Florida in terms of the recruiting rankings, the average ranking, but Florida is a solid second in the East. Tennessee's next at just under 19th average rank. Then Kentucky barely edges out South Carolina, and then Missouri and Vanderbilt kind of bring up the rear there. And then real quick, you can kind of see position talent ranking in the SEC here. Alabama's ahead of a lot of them. But if you go over here to the kind of average, the offense and defense, Georgia, number one talented in the East offense, fourth in the country. Florida is 12th in the country, second in the East. South Carolina right behind them in offensive talent. And I think a lot of that would probably have to be due with those transfers that came in. And they have recruited some pretty good players. Defensively, Georgia, again, top in the East. Florida, again, second. Tennessee would be third, and Kentucky right behind them in terms of talent in the East. So let's look at, like, we've seen kind of the talent. We see what they did last year. Well, what are they bringing back? So these production numbers include transfers in. They may not include the most recent transfers out, but they include transfers coming in. So you kind of see where they rank nationally and how they stack up to each other. Tennessee, why are they getting so much love? They're 19th in the country in returning production. 81% of their really good offense is coming back from last year, which is 14th in the country. About middle of the road, a little bit better than average in defensive returning production, but they really hang their hat on that offense. Georgia, this is where you kind of rely on recruiting. You see they're kind of towards the back half, below average in returning production, but you kind of rely on that recruiting that they can kind of reload. Florida lost some guys in the transfer portal, gained some, but for the most part, you kind of had a net loss of production. You're hoping some guys can step up and play and kind of take some roles on at probably, you're thinking the wide receiver position and a few other spots like that. Missouri, Kentucky, Vanderbilt are all kind of middle of just a little bit above average in returning production. South Carolina, when you add the transfers in, you see here 24th in the country returning production, 27th on offense. Not great on defense, but the defense wasn't very good last year anyways. So that's kind of just returning production total, kind of the formula with how many tackles, how many catches, how many passes are kind of coming back. But we can kind of take a deeper look at each side of the ball here. So just returning starters, Florida returns 5. They returned 19.3% of the pass attempts from last year. Anthony Richardson did not get to throw the ball very much last year. He had a few games where he did, but for the most part, he did not. But Florida does return a good amount of their offensive line snaps from last season. And this includes transfer from Louisiana, those guys they brought in. Their snaps are included in this total. And then six starters coming back on defense for Florida. No kicker starts coming back, and you return your punter. Georgia, offensively, they return a good bit. You see they return a majority of their passing attempts. Stetson Bennett's back. You lose JT Daniels, but he wasn't your starter by the end of the year. Returning snaps in the offensive line, basically 70% coming back, so still pretty good. And they've recruited really well in that area. Defensively, you only return 3 guys with starting experience, but that's the side of the ball they've recruited really well. And you wouldn't expect them to take – they're going to take a step back because they were historically great last year, but I wouldn't expect a huge step back with their talent level and kind of the coaching they've had there. Don't return their punter. I don't know if that matters, but they return their kicker, which is always good. If you have a good one, it's nice to have them back. Kentucky returns both specialists, but not a lot else outside of that. Return 4 starters on offense, less than half the returning snaps on the offensive line, and 4 starters on defense. They do return 100% of the pass attempts last year. Will Levis is back, and he's getting a lot of praise, but we'll talk about him a little bit more later. Missouri, similar spot on offense, only returning 4 starters, 6 on defense. They're going to be searching for a quarterback. They got 17% of their pass attempts coming back, and I don't know who it's going to be. I don't think they really know who their quarterback is just yet. They tried to get a few guys in the portal. They lost out on Gary Bohanna to USF. USF came and got him. They thought they might get him from Baylor. But they are returning a good amount of their offensive linemen. So they were able to run the ball last year, so maybe they can lean on that again, even though they did lose their running back. South Carolina, again, only 4 returning starters, but they're bringing a ton in the transfer portal. You see they've maintained, looks like, a good number of their offensive linemen. and 5 starters on defense and the punter. No kicker, though. So if the kicker was good for them last year, it's going to be tough. You see Tennessee, 9 returning starters on offense, 98.14% of all pass attempts are returning. Hendon Hooker, he's pretty good. He had a really good year last year, and they're returning almost their entire offensive line in terms of offensive line snaps. 7 starters on defense come back. 13. You got 13 starts from the kicker and punter, so both those guys return. Vanderbilt returning almost all their pass attempts, a decent amount of their offensive line snaps. They lost Steen to Alabama, which definitely hurts, but they still return a pretty good group there. 6 guys return on each side of the ball, and the kicker as well. So we've kind of talked about the talent, what's returning, how they played last year. Let's look at kind of the schedules now. And we'll talk about odds here. So Georgia's the overwhelming favorite to win the East. Their division title, they're minus 550 to win the division. Second in that is Florida, who's plus 1,000. So you bet 100, you win 1,000. Kentucky is fourth, I believe, at plus 1,200. Missouri is sixth, I believe, at plus 8,000. South Carolina is at plus 4,000. Tennessee is actually third at plus 1,100. Vanderbilt is plus 40,000. Now, if you want to bet Vanderbilt to win the SEC outright, this is a Kevin Malone from The Office. He's got John Cougar Mellencamp to win an Oscar. It's a similar thing. If anybody gives you these kind of odds, you got to take it. They are plus 100,000 to win the SEC. Tennessee's plus 5,000. South Carolina plus 15,000. Missouri plus 30,000. Kentucky plus 5,500. Georgia plus 155. So, they may have a shot. Florida plus 4,500. So, these are all from DraftKings Sportsbook. DraftKings seems to think that Florida, it would be second in terms of the second best odds to win the division. So let's look at Florida's schedule here. Obviously, tough opening, Utah and Kentucky, but they get them both at home. USF, and they travel to Tennessee. And then you can kind of see the schedule here. If you're watching this video, you probably know the schedule by heart here. But let's look. I kind of went and did the talent ranking from previously and see how does each team kind of match up with what their schedule has. So if you see green, that means you got a good chance. You have a talent advantage. If you see white, it means you're pretty close. If it's red, that means you have a talent disadvantage. So you see here, Florida has a talent advantage in most of their games. They would have a talent disadvantage against LSU, Georgia, and Texas A&M, which unfortunately are 3 games in a row. But you do get LSU at home. You get Georgia and Jacksonville, which is always tough, and on the road to Texas A&M. So if you can kind of win that LSU game at home, you have a talent advantage in every other game. Obviously, this does not include development. So maybe you have guys that are more talented but haven't developed. You obviously have to factor that in. When looking at preseason SP Plus from Bill Connolly of ESPN, kind of did the same thing. Where does Florida rank in its preseason SP Plus? Where do their opponents rank? This is a little bit tougher. Teams like Tennessee's 9th in SP Plus. Kentucky is 20th, so just a little bit higher than Florida. Florida's 23rd in SP Plus. So you see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 games where they would be underdogs, I guess, according to the SP Plus. Now, this does change during the season, but that includes Utah, Kentucky, and Tennessee. So 3 of the first 4, and then after that, Georgia and Texas A&M further down the line are the other 2. Georgia, we'll kind of move on to them here. Oregon in Atlanta to open the season, then it's kind of normal fare from there. They play Samford. I believe Kirby Smart's dad played there. We'll see how they deal with that throwing offense. I'm sure they won't have as much trouble as Florida did. Georgia's 3rd in talent. So when you look at them, Oregon's actually a top 10 team in talent. New head coach, new quarterback. You expect them in the games in Atlanta. You expect Georgia to probably win that one. there ain't another game on the schedule where the talent's really close. Florida is closest after Oregon. So Georgia plays two teams that are top 10 in talent. One of them being Florida. Other than that, they're kind of way out in front of everybody they play. It's going to be similar SP Plus. They're also third in the SP Plus. You can see by the green here, they're overwhelming favorites for most of their games. Tennessee, they kind of end with three of their tougher ones: Tennessee, Mississippi State, and Kentucky, according to SP Plus. And Georgia, that should be Georgia Tech there. So you get, you see Georgia should, that's why you're seeing that 10.5 win total. Kentucky's win total was at 8. I didn't mention Florida. They're at 7. Kentucky's at 8. They were at 7.5 and have gone up to 8. So people were obviously betting them over 7.5 and pushed that up a little bit. They have a pretty easy non-conference schedule. It's something Louisville, I think Louisville is going to be a tougher game than people think at the end of the year, but you start the season Miami of Ohio, at Florida, Youngstown State, Northern Illinois. If you beat Florida, you're going 4-0 into the Ole Miss game. And then if you beat them, you have South Carolina and Mississippi State, which are probably winnable. The two Mississippi State schools as your cross-division games this year. Looking at the talent, Kentucky's 25th in talent. So obviously Florida's higher. So there's one game. Ole Miss is a little higher. South Carolina is technically a little higher. Mississippi State is lower. Tennessee and Georgia are both higher. So you have 5 games like Florida where you're or 5 games at a talent disadvantage. It's kind of, and it'll probably flip for the SP Plus. Like Florida was kind of the opposite. 1, 2, 3, 4 games where you had an SP Plus disadvantage. Georgia, Tennessee, Ole Miss, and Mississippi State. SP Plus likes those teams quite well. You look to the right here to Missouri, there's a little bit of carnage in the SP Plus. Missouri's 52nd. This Louisiana Tech ranking is not quite as bad as that, but Kansas State's going to be a tough game. Auburn, Georgia, Florida. The winnable ones seem to be, based on this, you got New Mexico State, you got Vanderbilt. Those seem to be kind of the more winnable games. Looking at the team talent, you see it's a pretty similar story. They're actually a better talent than Kansas State, but Kansas State's, pretty decent team last year. You expect them to be pretty good. Louisiana Tech, you should be able to beat them. Abilene Christian, you should be able to beat them. Vanderbilt, you should be able to beat them. New Mexico State. It's kind of that Kansas State game is kind of your swing game or getting close to it, 5.5. But Missouri's going to have a tough time, I think, this year, just in terms of their talent level and kind of their performance the last couple of years. Seems to be trending downward, at least on the defensive side of the ball. South Carolina, you saw a big infusion of talent. You see they're 20th, but they still got some tough games. Arkansas is going to be a tough one. Georgia, obviously, have a talent disadvantage there. Texas A&M, Florida, and Clemson. Those are obvious talent disadvantage games, and you got some tight ones that maybe look a little bit tighter here on paper, kind of toss-ups. But then you look at the SP Plus, South Carolina's 46. So you got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 games where you have an SP Plus disadvantage, and their win total is 6. And I think there's plus money to the under now. People have kind of bet that over, and they're trying to get people to come in on the under here of 6. But if SP Plus is any indication, they got 7 tough games and then a couple that maybe toss up. So they have a tough schedule, but they brought in a ton in the transfer portal. So maybe they really take a big jump up there. Tennessee, SP Plus loves them, 9th in the country. They're pretty good. So they only have 2 games where they're predicted. They'd be predicted to lose right now in SP Plus. Alabama and Georgia, 2 of the top teams in the country, the top 2 teams in the conference for sure. Talent level, though, you got Florida has got better talent on paper. LSU, it's a tough matchup. Georgia, so that goes from 2 to 4. And then South Carolina is kind of a toss-up right there. 2 to 5. in the talent level. So, five losses puts you under 7.5. Right now, the under is plus 135. You think there's probably a few guys on the Tennessee team outperforming their recruiting rankings. So that maybe not be the most indicative, but I think it may be somewhere in between where SP Plus has them and where the talent has them. Vanderbilt looks kind of like you thought, but their over under is 2.5 with plus 120 to the over right now. I kind of like the over. That's probably the only bet I'm going to talk about. I like that. I think they can go beat Hawaii and Elon, and then they beat Wake Forest or Northern Illinois, and you've cashed, right? They're over 2.5 in the first 4 games. After that, I don't think there's a lot of wins after that, but you might be able to go over in those first 4. SP Plus, not as much. Wake Forest is obviously pretty good, but I think you got a shot against the other 3. Beyond that, not so much, not much of a shot there. One thing I did want to talk about with Kentucky, I think they're obviously, we saw their second. They were not returning a ton of production from a team that was really good and probably better than I thought last year. Looking at the metrics, they were pretty good. But one thing that concerns me is how much they lost last year, and then is Will Levis maybe getting overhyped a little bit. So this is something I put out earlier today, just kind of getting ready for this and looking at things. In SEC play last year, which quarterback played better? I think you have a case for both guys here in QBA and QBB. QBA had more touchdowns, but also more interceptions. He also had less yards per game, less yards per attempt, lesser completion percentage. But if you're all about the touchdowns, he had more touchdowns, right? Quarterback B, higher completion percentage, higher yards per game, less interceptions, less touchdowns. But, what are you looking for? More rushing yards as well. So, but the thing is, quarterback A is Will Levis, who people are talking about as a top 10 pick. Some people have even said he's the number 1 pick, which seems insane. And then the quarterback B is Emory Jones, who got ran out of Florida, ran out on a rail, basically. Out of town, people were booing him. They were ready to get rid of him. And this is just an SEC play. So Will Levis had some great games. He had a great game against Louisville to end the year, played pretty well in the bowl. But you see this combined with his kind of propensity to throw picks and the fact that if we go back and look at their returning production, one thing we didn't talk about is the coaching staffs here. You look at Kentucky. They're replacing an offensive coordinator and an offensive line coach, along with, we already talked about a lot of their offensive line. Their offensive line coach got hired by Alabama. The guy was a really good coach. They had 2 really good offensive line coaches in a row. So maybe you might feel that Mark Stoops is really good at hiring offensive line coaches. That'll be just fine. But you're not going to get the benefit of Will Levis in the same system year 2. I don't think it's similar. I believe the guys have similar backgrounds that he hired. I think one guy was a Rams guy, one guy is a 49ers guy. So it's the Shanahan tree. So it could be similar, but it's not exactly the same. So you're breaking in a new offensive coordinator and a new offensive line coach. That could be tough. And you also lost Wan'Dale Robinson, who was one of the best players in the country, a guy that could have started at most SEC schools last year and got a big chunk of Levis's targets and things of that nature. So it'll be really interesting to see if Levis can make that next step. He's obviously got talent. He's obviously got the traits, but can he make that next step with all the changes happening around him? Because he does need to make a step up. His numbers last year were not indicative of a top 10 pick. So if he kind of wants that, he's got to make a step up. Looking back through here, you can see Florida, kind of looking at it from Florida's angle here, because most people watching this are Florida people. You see Florida's got some opportunities. They got a bunch of talent. I think we've talked in other spots about the depth as being an issue. But the top-level talent is there on paper. Now you got to get these guys to perform. But if you can have some help, get those guys to perform, there's no reason Florida couldn't finish second in the East and have a better season than anticipated. Right now, their over-unders at 7 wins. If they have pretty good health, I think throughout the year they can get over that number. You get injuries in some key positions, then maybe you go under there. But that's just kind of a quick look at the SEC East. I think it'll be a really interesting conference. Obviously, the top seems to be decided, but a really interesting conference aside from that. 2 through 4, 2 through 5 is really going to be interesting, especially with what South Carolina's brought in the portal, bringing in a guy with a lot of talent like Spencer Rattler. Really good quarterback division, really. Stetson Bennett, say what you want about him, but he was productive last year. Hendon Hooker, Rattler, Anthony Richardson, Levis has got the traits. If somebody steps up in one of these other schools, Missouri, Vanderbilt, you may get a guy that can do some things, but I wouldn't probably bet on that. So that's just kind of a quick look at the SEC East. We'll have some more stuff this week. I know we'll have another college football games that made us. We'll have Parker Fleming talking about 2009 Utah and TCU, which will be really interesting. We'll do some more stuff. I think we're going to have a Utah preview coming out in the next couple weeks. So we'll kind of do a deep dive on Utah and their schemes and what they like to run. If you like this kind of stuff, follow me on Twitter at Seth Varnadore. I put out that Will Levis, Emory Jones comparison earlier tonight. So follow me on Twitter. Subscribe here if you enjoy this. It's going to be a lot of Florida Gator SEC content during the season. Film breakdowns, that kind of thing. So if you like it, subscribe, leave a comment. Let's game the algorithm together here. Thanks for watching.